Hello, Ripple folks. My name is Ron, Karma Coverage on the XRP forum, and I'm going to try and do a quick read through on this article and see if I can add some color to some of the things I didn't get to put in writing. So the basic idea here was to try and describe all the connections that are coming about through this RippleNet system and these distributed ledgers, and I hope I did that. Go ahead and get going. The totality of the new global financial architecture is one that needs to be looked at through the prism of complex adaptive systems. To understand the structure of the new complex adaptive financial system, we need to look at the patterns that emerge from the system's various types of connections. The pattern of these connections is often referred to as a topology, and these patterns are often expressed and observed by looking at the system's network graph. One visual hallmark of a complex adaptive system is fractal scaling. I ask that you take a minute to look at this, so let's go ahead and do that. And this is one of these shapes that's got some kind of significance, but the point is, as you zoom in or scale down or up, whichever way you want to look at it, you find the same pattern. And so it's that idea of the same pattern at various scales repeating that is what I think we're seeing here in the global financial system. So my hope with that visual cue was to help you understand the fractal patterns unfolding with Ripple's spearheading the assembly of a new complex adaptive financial system. For those further interested, there's courses on fractal scaling. Go ahead and move on down. For an example of fractal scaling, let's look at atoms and solar systems. Atoms have electrons that move in orbits around a nucleus. These atoms make up materials that make up planets, which move in an orbit around the nucleus sun. I'm primarily using this example as a mental illustration to further the visual example in the video before. The idea is to show how the same pattern can exist at the big macro solar system scale while being comprised of or made up of the exact same pattern at the micro atomic scale. You do see the same pattern regardless of scale. One reason I see Ripple D as an acceptable base technology to enable building a global complex adaptive financial system or ecosystem of financial networks and ledgers is because it can have an internal on-ledger network, like at the micro atomic scale, of trust lines, order books, and of course the UNL validators, while a bunch of ledgers can be assembled into an external, larger network of ledgers, like a big solar system, with interledger protocol and payment channels being the primary connection method. Connecting many X-current ledgers, the exchange and exchange order book ledgers. This is the crux of the rest of this write-up, and I'll be trying to expand on the internal topology of each ledger and the external topology of all ledgers being interconnected, making the Internet of Value. In an effort to avoid any confusion, there are a few terms I sometimes use interchangeably. In the crypto world, people talk about blockchains as being a network and as being ledgers. Some even talk of them as being ecosystems. I frequently swap out the words network and ledger, and ecosystem is a word that you find in complexity science where you are looking at all the interconnections that make up that ecosystem. I believe in the end, these digital assets will be valued upon their utility basis within the ecosystem which they exist. So for XRP, this basis would be the utility value of paying transaction fees and providing connective liquidity to the global financial ecosystem or topology upon which XRP exists. XRP, in one sense, I'm going to go off the writing here, is similar to a postage stamp's utility value within the ecosystem of a global postal network. But the liquidity portion is interesting. Hard to explain a little bit, but in order for the value to move between two ledgers, the value does have to be floated. And floating value involves time, and time involves opportunity cost. So you could have that value deployed to some other means. So with XRP as a digital asset sitting in between domestic economies, the deeper the liquidity, the more liquidity there is, the easier those domestic economies will be able to have value flow between them. So I didn't really expand on that in the writing. I mostly just stuck to the postage stamp utility value for paying a transaction fee. But I did want to just verbally highlight the liquidity portion, that it is critical. So back to this thing. Obviously, if a postal network, if you can put a stamp on a package and the postal network can only take it to your neighbor, it's not very useful. If that postal network can take your package to the other side of the world, that stamp gains a lot more value. So that's kind of the utility value basis on the postage idea. Let's see, where were we? Without the postal network to deliver a package, the stamp is a useless token and is without value. The shape of the Internet of Values networks of financial networks graph is an emergent metamorphosis of the global financial system in which XRP must find its place. So what I'm kind of trying to say there is, you've got all these networks, they will compete. The beautiful, brilliant idea of interledger protocol is a level playing field. It is what makes the Internet of Value a viable idea. So that's all kind of getting the word metamorphosis, that's all getting kind of stitched together currently. There's nobody single actor in charge of how those elements connect. That's why I use this term. And I also use the term metamorphosis because I think these systems are gapping up. And I think that's overall a good thing for the global financial system. Increasing speed, transparency, all the stuff you hear. So on any Ripple D consensus ledger, aka RCL or X current ledger, one example being the XRP ledger, there's several internal on-ledger connection types. There are several methods of making connections on ledger that I do not touch on in this write-up, such as escrow, multisig, checks, and there are a few others. However, I do want to look at these on-ledger connection types. There's the obvious validators in the URL. This is where and how XRP ledger or any Ripple consensus ledger, blockchain, etc., obtains its nature of distributing trust. While the decentralized aspect is critical to the whole breakthrough of enabling new trust arrangements, it is not overly critical for the financial ecosystem's topology, because the XRP ledger, within all the ledgers of the financial global system, is only one ledger, or a node in the grand global scheme. There are plenty of other folks who are more authoritative on the technical aspects of Ripple D's UNL being distributed. I have been pleased to see what they've been doing this year on that regard, with Ripple stepping back from the UNL. But anyway, for the purpose of this write-up, it's sufficient to assume that XRP's UNL is distributed. Now, this is where the fun stuff starts. So IOUs, this is the first glaring improvement that Ripple D, a distributed ledger, has as a blockchain technology made to the original Bitcoin blockchain ledger technology. IOUs enable various types of value, be it fiat, Bitcoin, gold, whatever, risk exposures, to be represented on ledger. So the important thing with IOUs is that they enable order books. When I first saw Bitcoin, I think this was in 2010 or 11 or somewhere in there, Honestly, didn't really get it. Did not see any financial innovation. I didn't quite understand why we needed a new currency. I was not educated on the double spin problem and all that stuff. But when I ran into Ripple and I saw the IOUs and the capacity to have on-ledger order books, it really invoked a lot of the thinking and the challenges that I did not really ever find a solution for in some of my prior work and thought on real estate markets. And so from one point, basically because of this tool being on Ledger, this order book tool, you can really set up a situation from my real estate thinking where the IOUs are issued by the property, and I'll make another video about this. But the fact that we have order books and wallets to show who owns these IOUs, it just was shocking. So anyway, order books are very important. Order books are an old tool used for making markets. When you think of the guys on the New York Stock Exchange floor back in the day shouting orders at the guy at the trading desk called the specialist, the tool the specialist is using to make the market that they're trading in or acting as a market maker for is an order book. So these are the guys that hold the trades. They also hold inventory. This comes back to the liquidity aspect and floating that capital. These specialists, which I'll get to in a second, but these are effectively interledger protocol connectors. So they manage an order book internally or at the trade for the trading desk. So by contrast, the original blockchain ledger technology does nothing more than provide a distributed ledger. Great, fantastic, but it's only for a single unit of account, i.e. Bitcoin. The technology does not have IOUs on Ledger, and therefore it cannot have order book functionality on Ledger, and it's just you just can't do a whole lot with it without that functionality. Requiring the order book functionality be performed off Ledger. This is why we see all these crypto exchanges who run their own ledgers with order books exchanging Bitcoin for fiat. And as I was just saying, from a financial engineer's point of view, this shortcoming of basically just being the original innovation anyway, being a ledger for a single unit of account, it's lacking of usefulness, I guess. To set the stage for the global financial system and fractal scaling, let's notice that the global financial system is made up of a bunch of domestic financial systems. A few of these domestic financial systems are interconnected with their neighbors, more so than they are with their non-neighbor domestic financial systems, forming clusters like the Eurozone, the NAFTA and all that, and the Asian economies that trade likely with themselves more. So when you look at this situation from a network density perspective, you end up seeing a couple of clusters of domestic economies where there's lower transaction fees, more trust. They're more interconnected, and of course each one of those clusters is made up of a bunch of smaller domestic economies, each of which does have its own government currency, central bank, and for the sake of this write-up, domestic settlement system. So on that stage, how important are order books? Well, they're extremely important, as I'll get to right here. An order book will sit at every point at which these domestic economies build an on or off ramp to each other. If you think of an economy's network graph, order books are the nodes that make up the network's boundary. Notice the nodes H, whatever these guys are. So these are the guys. Each one of these is a domestic economy, or possibly a cluster, maybe an economic zone with these guys being the domestic economies. Either which way, where you see the overlaps here, these nodes right here are the connectors, and they will be using order books with, and this guy's a good example here. So he would have an order book with this group and that group, between this group and this group, and between this group and this group. So he's really in a good advantaged position relative to these other connectors who do not have the full view. Likely this guy is going to make more arbitrage profits if this was a real situation. So this setup is very similar to what we see in the Ripple patent by Stephen Thomas and Bob Way. So I was trying to just highlight these keyword here is trust boundary. So a trust boundary could be a jurisdictional, legal, an economic, currency, a legal jurisdictional boundary. And then you can see the overlaps. So order books, therefore, play an incredibly important role in the topology of a Ripple net, as they sit at the boundaries where these two economies intersect. As a financial tool, order books function like a weighing machine. So I imagine the Lady Justice holding the scale, except I think in finance we take the blindfold off and we call the scale evaluation machine. We want to see how much is on each side. What are these things worth? Evaluation machine where the two things of value are weighed against each other to discover what valuation makes the scale fall into equilibrium. So when a market is going, into equilibrium state, you generally find small spreads, not a lot of disagreement between bid-asks, your bid-ask spread or your buyers and sellers. When you see markets leaving an equilibrium state, think of the 08 financial crisis, you had a lot of these CMOs and other CDO type toxic assets, whatever you want to call them. The spreads completely blew out, and in fact, a lot of those spreads, a lot of those markets froze. The spreads were so blown out that neither buyer or seller could come to terms. Interestingly, that's where second market came from. That's where second market came into play in the wake of the financial crisis to try and unfreeze some of those markets where the spreads had blown out. And if you're going to be a market maker, you want big spreads, because the spread, as a market maker, you're only going to get a chunk of that spread. Some of that spread is there for transaction fees. This is why making transaction fees low is important. So, I would imagine second market did well because those assets, every asset they traded in had blown out spreads. Anyway, back to the thing. Cross-ledger clearing and cross-ledger settlement. So clearing, I sort of think of, I haven't nailed down a solid definition of what this is relative to settlement, but more or less, consumer level settlement, netting activity. I believe that you have a lot of these consumer level transactions. They go between bank A and B. Some of that can be netted out. If bank A owes bank B $10 and bank B owes bank A $5, they only really need to settle up for $5 after they've netted that out. And oftentimes you see this going through a clearinghouse. So I'm not sure if Visa would technically kind of qualify as a clearinghouse type of an institution, but actually one of the things, I've posted this on the XRP forum before, but one of the things that helped end the financial crisis was ICE set up a clearinghouse for swaps, which were previously traded OTC, so there was no real central spot or anywhere to go and figure out the full market's activity. And once those swaps went on a clearinghouse, what happened is ICE plays the counterparty for every trade, and that reinserted trust into the system, which allowed all these holders of these mortgage-backed securities and these assets that needed the swaps, which were effectively insurance, allowed those guys to then, reduce the risk, which made the buyers willing to bump up their bid, so that helped unfreeze the market for those kinds of things at that time. So the clearing, the reason I said that is because the clearinghouse aspect is kind of, and for a period of time I had thought of XRP ledger is a bit of a clearinghouse. I say right here that now I think it's kind of a settlement house. I'm not sure if that's the word in the financial vocabulary world or something, but that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it at this point. So clearing, you can basically have this netting activity unfold. Settlement, this is the finalization of any remaining balance after clearing has netted out all flows, and this is the point at which both parties' obligations are discharged. The transaction is settled, it's over. So that's the difference between clearing and settlement. Clearing may still leave a remaining balance after the netting activity has unfolded. And I am, as I just said, starting to see XRP ledger as a little bit of a settlement house, and I'm not should do some more research and find out if that's a thing or not. But maybe I'm making it up. Now I'll get right back to order books, but let's first discuss the role of connectors within ILP. These are the actors in the network that hold an account with provisioned liquidity on more than one ledger, be it USD, Euro, JPY, XRP, BTC, whatever. This role of a connector is effectively as important as the function that order books perform. These connectors are indeed the equivalent of yesteryear's New York Stock Exchange specialists, albeit at the international global level between the cryptos and the different domestic economies and all that. But they are the guys who are making the markets between USD, fiat, and equities. In the RippleNet architecture with ILP, these connectors will have wallets on all of the 2+ ledgers that they act as a connector for. It's somewhat unintuitive that the value never leaves the ledger upon which it resides. Let me read this paragraph, then I'm probably going to expand on it, but this is an odd point, but interesting. The connectors function by using their own internal ledger, which accounts for the balances they hold on all of the fiat and crypto ledgers they connect. To facilitate a cross-ledger payment, they receive fiat on the fiat ledger. The value does not leave the fiat ledger. Just pretend these are commercial bank deposits or something. And they pay out crypto on the crypto ledger. This might seem a little more intuitive, but the value never leaves the crypto ledger. A Bitcoin is stuck on the Bitcoin ledger, and XRP is stuck on the XRP ledger. That's just how it is. With this model, the interledger connectors can be strung together to create a multi-hop transaction through many network boundaries. However, the value never leaves the ledger or network it starts on, because that's where it lives. Domestic fiat lives in the domestic economy. The value only changes ownership within that ledger, within that economy, along each hop through the transaction, from the sending upstream connector to the receiving downstream connector in each hop. So just like yesteryear specialists on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange who use order books as one of the tools of the trade, in the Internet of Value, it's the connector who will use internal order books as one of the tools of the trade. I'll skip that part for the time being. So the fact that the value never leaves the ledger means that, and this kind of goes along to informational arbitrage, because it's the connector. The connector is running their own internal ledger. So what's happening here is the connector has some value on ledger A and B, and they send some value off on ledger A to a different account, and they receive some value on ledger B. So the only person that would know whether that was good, bad, or ugly would be the connector on their internal ledger, because they know the exchange rates between the two effectively. There's no exchange rate in each individual trade, because one XRP is one XRP. It's the connection of the two where the order book functionality happens. And I think I say here in a second, but they're basically, through the seeking of arbitrage, they should minimize those spreads, and that's kind of systemically a good thing. So where was I? Order books must function a little bit. In the Ripple world, they're going to be have to You can do more triangular arbitrage and that type of thing. That's the point here, rather than just like a specialist on the floor who just used to have a two-sided order book. The function that will remain the same, again, is seeking to minimize the spreads. This is a type of arbitrage, and that's how things work. XRP ledger with its pathfinding function versus connectors with distributed pathfinding. So this was an interesting idea that kind of came to me in the writing of the last article about how a potential X-pool situation could be set up. This idea that connectors are effectively creating distributed pathfinding. This would be, analogous to how the ISPs create distributed routing. There's no one routing table for the whole world. That's kind of silly idea. XRP ledger does have its pathfinding function. So this function serves much like a type of arbitrage function. It makes sure that the value moves as cheaply as possible through the various IOUs and XRP on the ledger. So in a RippleNet world, we've got the XRP ledger with this capacity, and then we've got these guys, these connectors, who are sort of not coordinating with each other, but collectively they are performing the same function at a distributed level. So I think that's interesting, and haven't heard many Ripple folks talk about that, but I think that would be kind of another aspect of decentralization, if you will. Obviously, Ripple's not in charge of all the markets. So connectors are in the arbitrage business, and they use their internal ledger to perform this function. If a connector's making markets in 5 assets, they can gather information from each market and bid-ask spread, this type of thing, and perform some minimization function to minimize the spread, to find a combination of trades. This would be triangular arbitrage type of, you might be able to find a cheaper spread bouncing through 3 assets than connecting the original sending and destination asset. And so by a combination of trades that have a smaller spread, then the spread found in the available public market, so the direct market is what I mean by that. XRP ledger and any RCL has embedded into its internal ledger the pathfinding function, which performs a function much like the connectors do in their minimization of spreads, seeking arbitrage that I explained in the prior paragraph, albeit, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think I remember back at some point that the pathfinding formula, or whatever you want to call it, would only look for 7 direct hops. So think of the 7 direct hops as like a correspondent banking type of situation where you're, hopping through various IOUs to get between origin and destination IOU. But then when they did the synthetic order books, that basically means that as long as the spreads between each individual IOU to XRP are small enough, then you can, instead of having to do the computation for 7 hops, you can minimize this 7 number down to effectively 2 hops, or 3, 2 hops. So between originating IOU, XRP, and destination IOU, making XRP play that bridge asset function. So, and this is a wonderful chart here that kind of shows that idea. And I also wanted to put this chart in here because, in some sense, if you drew like a funnel here, you could consider this like the global network topology, the whole point of this write-up. This could be like the XRP ledger, and these could be like clusters, and these could be like domestic economies. And it's probably a bit of a stretch, but if you added one more thing over here and made it a funnel and drew lines so that you could show the different layers, then that would put XRP and the XRP ledger, at least within the context of RippleNet, at a very critical base level. If you can through synthetic order books going, using XRP as the same synthetic order book idea, if XRP is a bridge currency, it'll and you see these exchanges making XRP their base currency, so it's along the same ideas as that as well. All right. Given that XRP ledger has, or any RCL, has this level of pathfinding functionality freely available, anyone issuing an IOU on XRP ledger, available to anyone issuing an IOU on XRP ledger, then the connectors have to outperform that if they care to capture arbitrage profits. This is an interesting aspect, I would say, of leveling the playing field, because anybody can issue an IOU. So anyone issuing an IOU can only get, ripped off by the system up to the level that the XRP pathfinding functionality does. I think that's probably lowering the transaction cost in a sense, because your arbitrage, this is your arbitrage functionality. And it just, because it's a public, it's freely available, arbitrage functionality, then the actual connectors, who are the professional traders, they're going to have to beat this. And so I don't think that's like a hard task. I just think that sets a bar, which is probably a good thing in the long run. That said, XRP ledger only works for on-ledger trading. So a connector would not be competing against XRP ledger's pathfinding capability if they're trading across order books at different exchanges. So obviously, the pathfinding functionality is only on ledger. A lazy connector, and I've had this idea for a while, I don't know if anyone's done it, I don't know how useful it would be, but interesting idea, is a lazy connector could probably stand up the private RCL as their own, using that as their own internal ledger, and use its pathfinding functionality to find cross-exchange arbitrage opportunities. So imagine you're a connector and you're trading at 5 different exchanges, and on your own internal RCL, you issue some IOUs, or get the API to trade or send you the data for the bid-ask spreads on each IOU, and then continuously try to use RCL to make payments, and let the pathfinding functionality do the cross exchange or triangular arbitrage type of math for you. I'm sure that's not the best way to do it, but I think that could be done for fun, I guess. All that said, with many connectors looking for arbitrage profits and each performing their own pathfinding on their own internal ledgers, which stride the boundaries of domestic economic networks, the connectors as a group are performing a distributed pathfinding function within the context of the RippleNet global financial network topology. XRP ledger is a centralized pathfinding function to contrast the distributed version provided by the connectors, serving their own arbitrage self-interest. With XRP settlement, meaning no path, there's no path between XRP to XRP. It's just a simple payment call, and simply doing its thing as a distributed exchange, performing pathfinding across fiat IOUs. It is housing offers on a consolidated set of order books, being everything on the public exchange, on the public XRP ledger, which can act as a counterweight against any collusion on the other method of providing pathfinding, which is through the connectors seeking arbitrage profit. So if the major connectors working in a corridor attempt to kind of collude and price set, they can't really price gouge beyond the pathfinding functionality of the XRP ledger, assuming there's fiat IOUs issued on ledger and active markets there, as well as off ledger between the connectors. It seems to be only recently that XRP ledger's capability here is being more broadly recognized as a type of decentralized exchange. That's an interesting thing there. So back to clearing and settlement. So consider yourself to be in the position of a connector of two ledgers, and let's look at flow rates. So you'll start with a deposit of 10 values on ledger A, 10 values on ledger B, assuming a one-to-one exchange rate, just for simplicity's sake, and twice the flow rate from A to B is from B to A. In this situation, you can internally clear all the B to A flows because you have twice the flow rate in the other direction. So that's your netting aspect. When I say clear, I'm kind of mean netting there. But you cannot clear via netting your flows in the other direction because you have half the flow. Duh. This means that as time ticks, the value flow and value flows continue. You'll find yourself in the end in an end state with all your value denominated in and held on ledger B, the one with the most flow going towards it. This is when cross-ledger settlement becomes required. So interesting thing about this, I don't want to go there right now. All right, so now let's say you're forced to exchange your value on ledger B through a third type of value, let's just call it XRP, which shares a boundary or an order book on both ledger A and B. All of this is because the liquidity from B to A is not deep enough. You can't just move your position back, or there could be spreads there that would eat the movement and negate the whole arbitrage trade. So maybe that's for that reason it's not whatever. I'm just going to assume there's not deep enough liquidity for the sake of this situation. To move your position back to ledger A fast enough, meaning you need a fast settling asset with deep enough liquidity to get you back in your business of trading arbitrage opportunities. So when you're trading arbitrage, you're gonna you start with capital deployed in a certain situation and or setup, and then you do your arbitrage trades, but then at some point you got to get back to your original, hopefully plus a profit, an arbitrage profit, and the longer it takes for you to get back to your starting position so you can redeploy, taking more arbitrage trades, that time is an opportunity cost. Someone else is making those arbitrage profits while you're just getting back to your base position. So speed matters. There's a video with Miguel saying some crypto market makers are already using XRP Ledger to unwind, reposition capital, and settle multi-leg trades because XRP Ledger is so much faster than the exchange ledgers, and that I don't know about that, but the exchanges are kind of tied to the slow crypto ledgers, so whatever. Time not trading is expensive. Speed being important and value being intangible, as intangible as information. Doesn't mean it moves as well as information yet, but it is as intangible as information, always. It'll be the connectors who can manage all of this, finding cross-ledger arbitrage and rebalancing their position the fastest, who will make the most profit. Stay in the game, basically. If you're taking time to reposition, that's not in the game. XRP Ledger and IOU with IOUs has set the bar at a max of 3 seconds per trade. This is where I think the high-frequency trading guys who play in the equity, debt, whatever, FX markets may come into play. Surely they can run their own internal ledgers way faster than 3 seconds, as can plenty, I'm sure, hedge funds, trading houses, whatever. All of these types of people should, if they can pull it off, they should be looking at becoming connectors. XRP Ledger and RippleNet are designed as a market for floating value in between domestic economic ledgers with the capacity to settle that value into any domestic economy. This means that it is competitively relevant that XRP takes the lead on transaction speed versus other crypto. Fiat is not as suitable for some of this stuff as you hear all the Ripple people explain, so it's got to be relative to other crypto. Speed's duly important because it involves time, which involves cost of interest. Interest is calculated in time on the floated capital, and that interest that doesn't necessarily mean you need to be borrowing the floated capital, but you've also got the lost interest on your opportunity cost. So the interest is in there the cost of interest is always going to be there, and it's calculated on the time basis, which means faster. Minimizing the time required to float the value is cheaper, and cheaper means more arbitrage profits. Another real-world issue, and I don't expand on this, but this is pretty important. Maybe I should have bolded it. Is that to this puzzle is a legal bridge. So via the crypto to fiat markets with XRP, and any digital asset could be used like this, you're also trading not between two units of value, but also between legal jurisdictions that back those units of value. Legal and technical, but legal is the important part of this paragraph. This enables all of these jurisdictions the freedom to regulate these things as they wish within their economy, network, whatever you want to call it, domestic economy. This is where the central banks of each domestic economy come into play, both because they are the institutions that manage monetary policy. This is external connecting. I'm not looking at their central bank's role as settling internal to the domestic economy, and because of their role in the existing financial network topology, where they act as the final international settlement layer on any remaining imbalances that are not cleared through the commercial bank deposits and all that, by setting up and maintaining the balance of payments with other central banks. And I've got some links in here. There's a settlement account just to let you know what that is. And then I thought this guy did a reasonable job explaining kind of how that works. With regard to the domestic currency silos, the current boundaries and their transaction cost, both in terms of spreads being fat instead of thin, and time till settlement, which jacks up cost as well. It's its own type of back to the cost of interest. It's kind of built into the spread, actually. It's part of what can, I guess, slowness here can blow spreads out there. Anyway, these things are starting to look like a problem, persisting only by way of logic, by saying it's just how it is, and instead of actually being an unsolvable problem. I think the Ripple guys are doing a great job here in showing there is another solution. In conclusion, what I see assembling, and the whole point of this article, is much like the social graph, which Facebook enabled to be assembled. We're all these exchanges, and these order books are like, consider them like a friend request or a friend connection in the Facebook world. And by the way, Facebook did not invent the social graph. They simply made a tool that enabled the users of Facebook to document who they were friends, quote unquote friends with. Ripple is I see, what's happening here is in a very similar light. And these order books are that type of friend request. Now, technically, the payment channels are the method that these things are connected, but that's the way I'm thinking about this. So, in conclusion, what I see assembling is much like the social graph, with which Facebook enabled to be assembled, self-assembled really by the users, except this is in the financial domain. And actually, I see two different graphs forming here. We've got RippleNet with a trust graph, and I think that's where everyone who joins RippleNet, they sign a contract. There's rules for how do you reverse a payment if that needs to be happened. There's other rules that I wish I could get a copy of that. That'd be great to read, but I'm sure that won't happen. And anyway, so that's like a trust graph between the financial institutions, and that's very interesting. What's kind of neat here is, or I don't know, neat, but anyway, this isn't a public graph. This is not like the graph on the XRP ledger where we can see all the trust lines and their max balances, and this is kind of intangible and private. Really, I guess Ripple Inc. would be the only one with a view into that graph. But really, the point of this, and that spans the legal, contractual, whatever. The point of this whole article was really this order book graph, and how all these economies are becoming connected, and how this is self-assembling, more like the Facebook friend graph or social graph. And Ripple's not in charge of this. Now, Ripple might be in charge of this trust graph with who they allow to sign their contract, but these order book graphs and the traders can trade wherever they want. The connectors can connect anything. So this is a self-assembly process here. As these connectors grow in number and networks ledgers which they connect, the system should take up a fractal scaling pattern. You typically see that in complex systems. So with some connectors using order books domestically, and between FIs, maybe two different banks have different interest rates, and you can make an arb trade there, or exchanges like cross exchange arbitrage, trading GE on NASDAQ versus the American exchange versus the New York Stock Exchange, something like that idea. And they may potentially on the domestic sort of small scale, atomic scale, little domestic economy. This would be interesting to see materialize. But if the central banks did issue central bank digital cash, CBDC, and if that CBDC paid an interest rate, then there would be an arbitrage market between this central bank or the central bank, the CBDC, and the commercial bank deposits, and how the interest rates flow there. That could be a neat thing. Other connectors on the more big macro solar system scale will use the order books to connect domestic fiat to crypto. So where you're changing jurisdictions and all that, you're leaving the domestic economy, or domestic to domestic. That could be through crypto or not. It could be a direct order book. And then the central banks kind of have their own order book. That's the link I put in up here on the settlement account. And they, anything that's not effectively kind of netted out through all this other process, they maintain and will settle up internationally through the balance of payments. And it's kind of a rough and dirty explanation, and I don't know the full details of it, but that's what I gather at this point. And that does kind of invoke a balance of payments and your order book functionality here, measuring two different things of value. And that is the point of this write-up. So I hope that was entertaining. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.